My name is Pastor Hal York, and I'd like to welcome you to Truth in the Trenches. Today we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 7, looking at verse 9, where we read this: "In the twilight, in the evening, in the middle of the night, and in the darkness." Once again in Proverbs chapter 7, we find ourselves looking out our windows. It says in verse 6, watching a young man, an undiscerning young man, a young man thinking he can play with fire and not get burned. But verse 9 tells us that when this takes place, when the circumstances, and it is a common circumstance for all of our sin, we find ourselves walking into the darkness. Remember when Judas was getting ready to deny Jesus in the upper room, Jesus gave him the sop, and he says, and Judas went out and it was dark. The twilight, in the evening, in the middle of the night. And finally, he sums it all up in the darkness. Jesus said in John chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, that this is the judgment, that light has come into the world, and men loved the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds would be exposed. Men love darkness for one reason. They love evil. Their deeds are evil. Men by nature are afraid of the dark. But when we walk into a room at night, the first thing we do is turn on the light. We don't like to walk alone at night because it's dark. And darkness hides things. It hides people who can lurk in the shadows and want to do us harm. We can stumble over things or into things that can hurt us. But there's one aspect of darkness that man does not like. The part where we can get harmed or hurt. But on the other hand, darkness is a place we love because it hides our sin. It hides our intentions. Others can't see us. We often do in the dark what we would never do in the light. And what we do in the dark, we love. So consequently, we love the darkness. It's kind of a love-hate relationship with darkness, isn't it? On the one hand, we live with the fear of darkness and a life of loving the darkness. Is it any wonder mankind is so messed up and confused? The darkness, I think, here symbolizes the moral condition of this woman of the night, the affair, the sexual immorality. Proverbs 2:11 says, discretion will guard you, understanding will watch over you to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things, from those who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the way of darkness. Proverbs 4:19 says, the way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. What a commentary on our society. The reality is darkness may hide our sin from others, but it doesn't hide it from God. God sees everything in the light, and he sees everything perfectly. There's no darkness with God. So as we have seen other places in Proverbs, be on guard when you find yourself looking for darkness. What do I mean by that? Well, be on alert when you find yourselves looking for places to hide, avoiding people, avoiding watching eyes, avoiding people who may ask you hard questions you really don't want to answer. And when that happens, we find ourselves slinking into the darkness, into solitude, into loneliness, into unaccountability. If you read chapters 5 to 7 of Proverbs, you will see a great deal of darkness and very little light. You will see a great deal of pain and very little happiness. You will see long-term hurt for short-term pleasure. You will see the lifelong scars of playing with fire, the wrath of a betrayed spouse, the heartbreak of a family torn to shreds. And it all started in the dark, and it ends in despair and judgment. And it happened because this young man chose to ignore wisdom, the warnings of don't go down that street, don't play with this immorality, it's going to scar you for life. Don't play around with this thing. As Paul told Timothy, flee youthful lust. But this man chose to ignore that wisdom. And when you stop believing in wisdom, you'll start believing in anything. And this young man is naive enough to believe the flattery of this woman. He thought he knew more than God. He thought he could handle the temptation. He thought he could hide it from God and from others. But he didn't see what was about to happen to him. He saw none of these things coming his way that these chapters talk about. Why? Because he was walking in darkness. You can't see your hand in front of your face in this kind of darkness. All you see is right now. And that's always Satan's great ploy, to get us to think about right now. what the pleasures we want right now. That's all that matters. And he never tells you what's going to happen down the road. But that's what wisdom does. Wisdom knows where these things lead. But we choose to live in the dark. People who love the darkness will tell you what they found. But my encouragement to you is, and the Bible's encouragement to you is, don't listen to them. Don't believe them. They think they found treasure, but it's really trouble. Pleasure, but it's really pain. But because they don't know the difference, they're in the dark. God calls us to walk in the light, his light. He calls us to walk in accountability and transparency. In the light of his word, which is a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. It shows us what's down the road. And it warns us and it guides us in the way of life, in the way of light, in the way of peace. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And we need to follow him and look to his word. Very little good comes out of the darkness. We need to turn to the light and run to him. And he will show us the way that we should take that leads to blessing. The blessing of God, the joy of the abundance of this life. Sin destroys, righteousness builds up. God always blesses the righteous. May we never doubt that and walk in his light. May these truths guide us and guard us in the trenches of life as we seek to live for the glory of God and the good of others. May God bless.